I will try to be the pragmatic lawyer in a sense. I said to myself I will not take a stand clearly on the issue that it should be solved this or that way, because we have seen, as we heard Christopher Ross say, that the entrenched positions are part of the problem at the moment. I think you will probably see a little bit my thoughts on this. But we need to think in new ways. And I'm very grateful to be able to come here to discuss about how international law and how people who work with conflict resolution around the world think around this type of questions without myself being or pretending to be an expert on Western Sahara as such. So I will try to broaden a little bit. So a quick repetition of what you have heard around, just the focal points that I think, because it's very easy to be distracted by the details of the happenings of nearly 50 years of events and different situations. I think that from a Nordic perspective, we do think of Western Sahara as one of the last big decolonization cases. It is perhaps, together with Greenland that was mentioned here, the two most interesting cases. And of course, I think what Denmark did with Greenland in the 50s was a little bit what Morocco is trying to do in the situation of Western Sahara. I said I was going to be a little bit provocative, and I'm happy you're alive, in the sense that the status was changed. The constitutional status of Greenland was changed. It was transferred from being an international matter to being a domestic matter within the administrative constitutional position of Denmark. And why I'm saying this is because one of my main arguments is that an intrinsically internationalized situation will not be less internationalized if it becomes part of the domestic legal order. So you cannot do away with the intrinsic international character of the situation. And of course, it is true that we have accepted in international law that there is external but also internal forms of self-determination. In the case of decolonization situations, as well as in occupied territories, it has been the external form that has been the dominating one. I will also speak, coming from the Åland Islands, of course, I cannot avoid speaking later on a little bit about autonomy, because I think it is an interesting point. So, from the purely international law point of view, we have all these the ambassadors have spoken of many of all these resolutions. I would like perhaps to highlight these two last points. The European Court of Justice debating and still pending one case concerning natural resources, fisheries and tariffs, but also the African Court of Human Rights not pronouncing on a violation from the side of the states that have then recognized Morocco and the situation from the side of Morocco, but when accepting again Morocco in the African Union, but pronouncing clearly on the view of the majority of African states that this is a situation of occupation. And what I think is really interesting, saying that the self-determination understanding under the African Charter is wider than the one we find under the international covenants, which only speak about a general form of self-determination of peoples. And you will see soon why I think it's important, this wider understanding about self-determination. So we have two basic logics, and if one is a little bit pragmatic, we can say that of course, in some sense, the logics dominating is one understanding that we are super pragmatic, realist, effective control on the ground is what counts, and this is what we should be following. And the other one, which repeats that we have the UN resolutions, we have the courts. And why I think cases like this one are important in countries like the Nordic ones is because we have a number of issues today where it is really about the integrity of the idea of a rule-based society. So it's not only about how we deal with one specific case, it is what choices do we make between these two approaches to international relations. And of course, we need to do this in a smart way because there are various efforts to, let's say, take over the legal making around the world today with authoritarian trends far beyond the countries that are usually mentioned as authoritarian. So, to make a long story short, there is no obligation to accept autonomy per se. It is a constitutional option or an international option. It was mentioned earlier East Timor, and of course you have also heard that Martti Ahtisaari just was buried the other day. He used the discussion about autonomy and independence in Kosovo, in Aceh, and also it has been in East Timor. To have a certain spectrum is usually seen as a positive view on what are the many options there are. But there is no obligation to accept autonomy, nor is there an obligation to accept a compromise against the very idea of self-determination. There is an obligation to solve the conflicts, and of course there is an obligation to observe the idea of self-determination through the access to natural resources. And I think that this is really what the broadening, the convergence, if you want, between self-determination law and the law on occupation and what the African Court has been saying is that even in situations of colonization or occupation, the consent of the people concerned in the access of natural resources should be taken. So there is room to exercise discussion and put pressure on this issue, irrespective of the short-term status situation, maybe. So, as Christopher Ross was saying, I think that there is an apparent risk that things simply remain as they are, the status quo. This is the least, what is perceived as the least burdensome. But of course the costs, and this is what I'm trying to provoke here, a discussion of what are the costs of each of these choices that we make. And a cost here is, of course, that we do not discuss the issues of natural resources. We do not discuss the issue of the content of self-determination. We do not discuss one of the last cases of decolonization. There is also a chance that Morocco mobilizes the full power, the full military power that it can mobilize, and occupies Western Sahara fully. And there is the end of let's say, the discussion seen from the Moroccan point of view. There is the choice or the self-determination of external form as independence for Western Sahara, but there are also possibilities of associated states. as a form of independence. There is also the Tanzanian version, which the Zanzibaris would very much like to discuss further upon, of a federal union with two, at least on the paper, equal partners. And I find it interesting that there is no real discussion about this spectrum of possibilities at all. And then there is the issue of full or limited autonomy. I will not go through these details, but just simply to say here that to take, let's say, the Moroccan autonomy proposal at face value and discuss what does it really mean. The concept of autonomy is not an absolute concept that you really know what it entails. So if we go through this, the far bottom is what most lawyers would accept as a territorial autonomy. That is exclusive legislative powers with more or less a veto in the areas where the autonomy has its responsibilities. Which means then that you need to look at both how is the division done and how are then the special conditions looked at, but you need to look this balance of the elements of separation versus the elements of integration in such a proposal. And I think that what we see, it's very unclear in the proposal. I hear the ambassador saying that we should not even look at the proposal of autonomy because this is not a territory that is to be disposed by Morocco, says the ambassador from Polisario. However, we have seen that if you look at it as a disputed territory, a possibility of discussing autonomy is at least theoretically possible. So for all those states that are more on the side of Morocco, autonomy is still an option. And for those states, they have to make this analysis of what level of autonomy are we discussing about. Is this a true, full, exclusive autonomy or not? And how are the elements of separation arranged? So I will not talk to you about the Åland Islands. You're all welcome to come there if you have the chance. And each spring in March, we have the Kastelholm talks on peace. However, what I wanted to say is that and this is our conference today, I think is a little bit typical of this. We're extremely interested in finding the solution and less focused in identifying what are the real problems, the substantive problems on the ground. So the status issue comes to the way for dealing with the issues below the status issue. And how is the governance going to be done is obvious, but also how is security to be dealt with in the short run and in the long run is essential. And also, how do you deal with cultural issues? And of course, this is the matrix of questions as was defined in the Åland case. But I have not seen a matrix of issues below the surface of the status in the situation of Western Sahara. And I think we can discuss that even if the chance of actually achieving a special solution is feasible. So Sisyphus, I'm partly Greek, so I always have a myth to pull out of my arm. So Sisyphus, people think that any solution they propose is the easiest one. There is no easier solution. And I think that any party which proposes a solution needs to think above all of how do you ensure legitimacy, that is acceptance, first of all, among the people concerned, but also among all the other actors that have some interest in the area. And I have not seen much of the discussion on how do we ensure the trust. What we do know is that a problem is only modified by a solution. The problem does not disappear. Even in the Åland Islands, the so-called islands of peace, there are tensions, there is distrust. So if there is distrust in the midst of peaceful Nordics, what is the level of distrust we will have to deal with in any future solution in Western Sahara? I think I'll stick to this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sia.